The call lasted 43 seconds. I know because I checked my phone after. The way you do when your brain is trying to make sense of something your body already understands. 43 seconds. That's how long it took for everything to change. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this actually starts, which is not with the phone call, and not with the man who answered it. It starts with the version of me who thought she had everything figured out. My name is Isla. I was 26 when I took the job as a records coordinator at Holt & Associates, a private equity firm with offices on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago that made you feel small just walking into the lobby. I had a communications degree from University of Illinois, $17,000 in student loan debt, and a boyfriend named Preston who told me on our third date that he was going to be somebody, and I believed him. Preston was the kind of handsome that photographs well. Sharp jaw, easy smile, the kind of eyes that always looked like they were in on a joke you weren't. He'd grown up in Naperville, went to Loyola on a partial scholarship, and was 3 years into a sales career at a medical device company that paid him just enough to feel important. When we met at a mutual friend's birthday party, he talked for 20 minutes straight about a deal he was close to closing. I found it attractive. Energy like that, conviction like that. I mistook it for ambition. What it actually was, I would understand much later, was performance. We'd been together 2 years when I started at Holt. I won't pretend things were perfect before that, but the job changed the math in ways that took me a long time to see. I was suddenly in an environment where everything was big. The money, the decisions, the stakes. And Preston, from the outside, looked like he was standing still. He started noticing things. What I wore to work. Who I mentioned. Whether I seemed tired when I came home, and if I did, whether that was because the day had been long, or because I was pulling away. I learned to manage his mood the way you learn to drive in winter. Carefully. With one eye always on the road ahead. I didn't call it what it was. I called it a rough patch. I called it stress. I called it love that needed work. My boss was a man named Callaway Holt. Not Callaway from the list. This was a different man entirely. 51, silver-haired, the kind of quiet that fills a room. He'd built the firm from 2 employees and a borrowed conference room in 2003. By the time I got there, he had 43 people on staff and more assets under management than I could hold in my head. He had a reputation for being precise, and a separate reputation, which I heard about my second week from one of the paralegals, for being someone you did not want to cross. There were things people said about Callaway Holt, that he had connections that didn't show up on any organizational chart, that certain problems that landed on his desk got handled in ways that didn't leave paper trails. I filed those things away in the part of my brain labeled above your pay grade and went back to organizing quarterly filings. I was not supposed to interact with him directly. Records coordination sat 2 floors below the executive suite. But 6 months in, our main database system crashed during a time-sensitive audit, and I was the only one who knew where the physical backup files were stored, because I'd personally cataloged them during my first week, on a Saturday, because I was trying to make myself useful. His assistant tracked me down. I spent 4 hours in the executive suite helping his team reconstruct 2 years of documents. He noticed me then, not the way Preston meant when he accused me of wanting people to notice me. Callaway Holt noticed me the way a person notices competence, quietly, without making a production of it. 3 days later, I was reassigned as Executive Records Liaison, a title that meant I now worked 1 floor below him and interacted with his office daily. He called me by my last name for 4 months. Marchetti. Short, clean, like a period at the end of a sentence. He was never unkind. He was never warm. He was precise. I told myself it didn't matter one way or the other. I wasn't lying. I just wasn't telling the whole truth. Things with Preston hit a wall in November. He'd lost the deal he'd been working. A client went with a competitor after 6 months of groundwork, and Preston came home that Tuesday and drank most of a bottle of Jameson and said things he would apologize for in the morning. He always apologized in the morning. He was gifted at apology. Present tense, detailed, convincing. He could look at me over coffee with so much remorse in his face that I would feel guilty for still being upset. That night, he put his fist through the drywall in the hallway, 4 inches from where my head had been. I told myself it was the whiskey. I told myself he was under pressure. I told myself the version of him that apologized the next morning was the real one. And the version that put his fist through the wall was something else. A symptom, not a character. I packed a bag in the morning after he left for work. Then I unpacked it. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for 40 minutes, with my hands in my lap. I went to work. What nobody tells you about being in a relationship that's slowly consuming you is that the worst part isn't any single incident. The worst part is the accumulation. The way you start trimming yourself down. Your laugh, your opinions, the stories you'd normally tell, because you've learned, through repetition, which version of you is the safe one. By the time I was 18 months into things with Preston, I had become very small in our apartment. Neat, predictable, easy to manage. At work I was different. At work I knew what I was doing, and it showed, and nobody punished me for it. I think that was the thing Preston couldn't stand. He started calling during the day, 3-4 times. If I didn't pick up, he'd text, "You busy or are you avoiding me?" with no question mark, like it was already a verdict. I learned to respond within 2 minutes, or I'd spend the evening, proving I hadn't been up to something. I didn't know what something was. He never specified. That was part of how it worked. The day of the phone call, I was staying late to finish a filing ahead of a morning deadline. Everyone else had gone home. The floor was quiet except for the ambient hum of the building, that particular late-night sound of HVAC and elevator cables, and the city 100 feet below the glass. Preston had been texting since 6. It was almost 8. I made a mistake. I answered one of them with something I thought was neutral. Still at work, finishing the Aldane filing. Shouldn't be too much longer. And he read the word Aldane and his brain did something with it. Aldane was the name of a client. A male client. Preston had seen the name on a document I'd left on the counter 2 weeks before, and his brain had filed it somewhere, and now it came back. He called, I answered. The conversation lasted approximately 6 minutes and ended with him saying he was on his way. I hung up and stood very still next to my desk. The floor was empty. The building's lobby closed to non-credentialed visitors at 7:30. But Preston had been up here twice before. I'd brought him by for an office holiday party, and once to drop something off, and he knew the after-hours access code, because I had told it to him during a moment when I still thought that kind of sharing was closeness. I stood there and did the math on my options. Call security. What would I say? My boyfriend might come up here and be upset. Call a friend. It was 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, and most of my friends had stopped calling me as often lately because I'd become, without quite meaning to, unreliable, hard to reach, distracted. And then, without quite deciding to, I picked up my phone and called the one number I had that I knew would be answered. He picked up on the second ring. Marchetti. His voice was the same at 8 p.m. as it was at 8 a.m., measured, awake. Mr. Holt. I paused. I could hear myself breathing. I'm sorry to call you on your cell. I know it's late. What's wrong? The question was so direct that something in me broke loose. That careful management I'd been doing for 2 years, that constant calibration. My voice came out quieter than I intended. I think I need you to come back to the office. I stopped. I'm sorry. You don't have to. Are you in the building right now? Yes, 41st floor. Are you alone? Yes, for now. 3 seconds of silence. Maybe 4. Stay away from the elevators, he said. I'll be there in 12 minutes. He was there in 9. I won't pretend I understood what happened in the next hour. What I understood was this. There was a conversation in the lobby that I was not part of, but could partially see through the glass wall of the conference room where Calloway had put me. Preston arrived. He and Calloway spoke. I don't know what was said. I don't know what was implied. I know that Preston left, and that the way he left, quickly, without looking up, was different from any version of him I'd seen before. Calloway came back into the conference room and stood across the table from me. Are you hurt? No. Has he hurt you before? I looked at the table. Not in a way that Isla. It was the first time he'd used my first name. Not Marchetti. Not Ms. Marchetti. Just my name, clean and plain in the air between us. Has he hurt you before? I looked up. His face wasn't soft exactly. It was still, like he'd set everything else aside and was just waiting. Once, I said. He didn't. It was a wall. He nodded once. Like that told him what he needed to know. You're not going back to that apartment tonight, he said. Mr. Holt, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm telling you. He pulled out his phone. I have a property on the Gold Coast. It's not being used. You'll stay there until you sort out a plan. I stopped. Why would you do that? He looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Something so brief I almost missed it. Because I should have said something 3 months ago, he said. And I didn't. I didn't know what that meant. I filed it in the same place I filed everything about Callaway Holt. Above your pay grade, and I let him walk me out of the building. I stayed at the Gold Coast apartment for 2 weeks. It was smaller than I expected for a man like him. A 1-bedroom on the 12th floor, simply furnished with a view of Lakeshore Drive and a kitchen that had exactly 2 pots and a very good coffee maker. I later learned it was a place he kept for visiting attorneys who worked on sensitive cases and needed somewhere off the books. I tried not to think too hard about what sensitive meant. Preston texted for the first 3 days. Then he called from a different number. Then he stopped. I later found out why. I didn't ask how Callaway arranged it. I thought about asking and decided it was one of those questions that only mattered if the answer mattered, and the answer, whatever it was, didn't change the fact that I was safe. I went to work, I did my job. Callaway and I interacted the same as we always had during office hours, professionally, efficiently, without excess. He went back to calling me Marchetti. I went back to answering to it. But once, maybe a week and a half into my time at his apartment, he stopped by the building's front desk to leave something for me. A folder of documents that needed my signature for a reassignment of my office access. The doorman called up. I went down. Callaway was standing in the lobby in his coat, already half turned to go, and when I came out of the elevator he turned back and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Just checking. Making sure. "You're sleeping?" he asked. "Better," I said. "Thank you." He nodded. Looked like he might say something else. Didn't. Turned and walked back out into the November cold. I stood in the lobby for a minute after the door closed, holding the folder, trying to figure out what exactly was happening in my chest. I found an apartment in Logan Square in December. A 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a graystone, with good light and a landlord who fixed things promptly, and neighbors who were blessedly boring. I signed a 12-month lease and bought a new shower curtain, and stood in the empty bedroom on the first night, and breathed, just breathed. I didn't go looking for anything for a long time after that. I wasn't avoiding it, I was just remembering what it felt like to exist in a space where the air wasn't charged with someone else's expectations. To come home and not immediately read the room, to leave my shoes wherever I wanted and eat dinner at 9:30, if I felt like it, and watch the shows that I wanted to watch without negotiating. I know that sounds small. I know people who've never been in something like that read those sentences and think, those are just basic things. Of course you can eat dinner at 9:30, but when you've spent 2 years performing calm, performing easy, performing fine, the absence of it is enormous. It takes up the whole room. I gave myself until the new year to just be. Callaway's manner shifted in ways I couldn't quite name as January turned into February. We still worked the same way. He was still Callaway Holt in every professional sense, clear-eyed, demanding, exacting. But there were things. He started being in the records annex more often than was strictly necessary. Not hovering, he wasn't a hoverer, but present. Asking questions that were almost but not quite about work. "How are you settling in, Marchetti?" Whether I'd had the chance to try the taqueria on Milwaukee that one of the analysts had recommended. Once I came in early, 6:45, because I had a filing that needed to go out first thing, and found a coffee on my desk in the cup from the place on Wacker that was good, not the office pot that was merely functional. Nobody else was in yet. There was no note. I knew who had put it there. I kept that to myself. The thing about Callaway Holt is that he was not a simple man pretending to be complicated. He was a complicated man who had learned to appear simple. There is a difference. In March, during a late evening when I stayed to help prep for a board presentation, he told me something I hadn't known. His wife had died 11 years ago. An accident on I-90, black ice in February, the kind of thing that happens to a specific category of people. People who are just going somewhere, living their ordinary lives, and then aren't. They'd been married for 8 years, "I'm sorry," I said. And then, because it felt inadequate, "I didn't know." "Nobody talks about it at the office," he said. "I prefer that. Why are you telling me?" He looked out the window at the lake, dark now, the city lights fractured on the water. Because you've been careful not to ask about me, he said. And I find it, he paused. I find it considerate, most people asks. I thought about that. I figured if you wanted me to know something, you'd tell me. He turned from the window, looked at me with an expression I'd been trying to decode for months. That's exactly right, he said. He asked me to dinner for the first time in April, not in the office. He called me on a Saturday afternoon, which he'd done before for work things. And after the work thing was handled, there was a pause that was different from the usual end-of-call pause, and he said, I want to take you to dinner, Isla. Not work, just dinner. If that's something you're interested in. I was quiet for a moment. Why now? I asked. Because you've had enough time, he said. I hope, and I didn't want to wait any longer. Something in me registered the precision of that. Not I thought you'd be ready, or I thought you might want to, just. He had been waiting, and here was the waiting, and here was him telling me. Okay, I said. Saturdays. This is Saturday, next Saturday, he said. And I could have sworn there was something almost like humor in it. I said yes. There are things I learned about Calloway over the next several months that I processed slowly, the way you process something you half knew and were waiting to have confirmed. The connections people mentioned. They were real. Not illegal, exactly. The description that fit best was informal infrastructure, which is a polite way of saying that certain things in certain industries worked in Chicago in ways that had a lot to do with relationships that predated regulatory frameworks. Calloway existed in those spaces. He moved through them fluently. He was not a violent man, but he was not a man who was afraid of people who were, and that had its own kind of weight. I thought about what I wanted to do with that information. What I landed on was this. I had never seen him be cruel. I had never seen him use what he had against someone who didn't come at him first. And he had used it, whatever it was, to make sure I didn't spend 3 weeks jumping every time my phone buzzed. I wasn't naive. I knew what I was accepting. But I had also spent 2 years with a man who presented as perfectly ordinary and used that ordinariness as cover for something that left a hole in a wall and a particular look on my face that I caught in the mirror once and didn't recognize. Ordinary didn't mean safe. I'd learned that the hard way. The thing about falling in love with someone like Calloway is that it doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in accumulation. The same way the bad things had accumulated, but entirely different in texture. It's a Tuesday morning when he remembers that you don't like cilantro, without you ever making a thing of it. It's the way he listens, not waiting to respond, but actually taking in what you're saying and then sitting with it for a second before he answers. It's the fact that when you tell him something that makes you embarrassed about your past self, not Preston, other things, small things, he doesn't try to reassure you. He just nods like your past self makes perfect sense to him. It's the first time he says you should know before telling me something about himself. Like telling me is a thing he's decided, not an accident. I told him about the unpacked bag. The one I'd packed and unpacked in the apartment with Preston, the 40 minutes on the edge of the bed. He was quiet for a long time. What made you call me? He finally said. That night, I don't know, I said. I went through the list of people I could call, and at the end of it I called you. I think I knew you'd answer, and I knew you'd come, and I didn't have a good reason for either of those things. I just knew I would have come, he said, from anywhere. Why? He looked at me the way he had in the conference room that first night, like he'd set everything else down. Because it's you, Isla. He proposed on a Thursday, not a special occasion, no particular reason for a Thursday, except that it was the night we'd both gotten home on time and cooked dinner together in his kitchen. The Gold Coast apartment had been traded for something larger, something with 2 pots and 6 and a much better view. And we were sitting at the kitchen island with wine and the remnants of a pasta that had turned out better than expected, and he was looking at me with an expression I knew by then. What? I said. He reached into the pocket of the jacket he'd hung over his stool. He'd come straight from the office and set a ring on the counter between us. Simple. A solitaire in a plain setting. The way he did everything, without excess. I've been carrying that for 6 weeks, he said. I kept trying to find the right moment. I looked at the ring, then at him. Thursday night pasta is the right moment. Thursday night pasta is exactly the right moment. He paused. You don't have to answer tonight. You can think about it. Calloway, Yes, I'm going to say yes, as I know, he said, but he said it softly like he was glad to hear it anyway. I just wanted to make sure you knew you could take your time. I picked up the ring, held it for a second, set it back down on the counter and looked at him. That was the first thing you ever said to me, I said. That night on the phone, you asked if I was okay and then you told me it would be okay to take my time. He tilted his head slightly. I said stay away from the elevators. After that, I don't think I said that exactly. You implied it. I smiled. You've always implied it. He looked at me across the kitchen island with the ring sitting between us and the city lit up through the window behind him, and he said, Is that a yes? I slid the ring onto my finger. It's a yes, I said. It's always been a yes. I just needed enough time to get here. He reached across the counter and covered my hand with his. His thumb ran once, slowly, across my knuckles. Outside, Chicago went on doing what it does. Enormous and indifferent and full of lives being lived in all their ordinary difficulty. And in that kitchen, with the wine and the pasta and the plain solitaire on my finger, and his hand over mine, I thought about the 43 seconds of a phone call, and a man who'd answered on the second ring, and the version of me who had been so carefully small and was now, finally, at the end of the long work of becoming, full-sized again. It had taken time, a lot of it. It had been exactly enough.